Welcome back, everyone. This is the Oracle Decodes, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, and what Jesus has to do with it. In this piece, we're going to pick up on some things we've learned in our previous decodings, as always, but for this one, specifically, we're going to look at some information from part 2 of our decoding of ancient Egypt, when we looked at the Eye of Horus in a brand new way, and in our last piece, when we looked at the approximate 12-year cycle of the planet Jupiter, in the Oracle Decodes, Abraham and Ishmael and the Scapegoat, Child Sacrifice Part 2. So if you haven't yet seen at least those pieces, they're going to be helpful if you watch those first, as it will help you as we get into even more mind-blowing information we're going to be looking at in this decoding. So we're going to be looking at an event that's coming up quick on what we commonly call December 21st of 2020, something that's called the Great Conjunction, where the planet Jupiter and the planet Saturn come together in the sky. This screenshot is queued up for what we commonly call December 1st of 2020, and you can see the planet Jupiter here with the smaller appearing planet Saturn. Eventually, they're going to be moving so close together that by the time we get to the winter solstice this year, they're going to appear as one light in the sky. You can see that this great conjunction will be happening right below the constellation of what we nowadays call Capricorn the Goat. So we're going to also be looking at how the symbol of Jupiter has an interesting tie-in as well, and the Eye of Horus, and how this connects to what we're looking at here as well. So as we learned in our last decoding, the planet Jupiter has a big role to play in many of these famous stories that we're decoding, and the planet Jupiter, we learned, has an almost 12-year cycle. So we're going to be also looking for the first time, along with Jupiter, to the planet Saturn and the planet Saturn's approximate 30-year cycle. So we're going forward now to a screenshot from Stellarium of a sky story picture on the winter solstice of what we commonly call 2020. You can see here how closely together Jupiter and Saturn are now just below the constellation of Capricorn the Goat. It's just above the western horizon of the Earth, appearing as one luminary in the night sky. When you're looking up at it, it will be discovered and have been calling the real oracle or the real all-seeing eye. If you're on the ground, you're looking up at the real all-seeing eye from the perspective of a stargazer in the northern hemisphere. Now, this great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn occurs every 20 years, when the approximate 12-year cycle of Jupiter crosses paths with the approximate 30-year cycle of the planet Saturn. There are a couple of reasons why we're told that this great conjunction is so special. One is because it's occurring on the winter solstice, and the other is because it's the closest great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn that has been seen since what we commonly call 1623. It's my hope that one of the beneficial side effects to learning this information is that it inspires you to look up more, to actually go outside, face due south, and take a look at what's going on right outside your door, right above the horizon, right above your head. And even though it's very chilly nights where we live here in December, I hope that doesn't stop you from stepping out and taking a look up at the closest great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn that we've been able to see for almost 400 years. So this one, you'll find, again, by facing due south in the month of December. If you live here in what we commonly call America, it will only be visible for a short time after the sun goes down, so that first hour after sunset. Face due south and then turn your head to the right or to the west, and you'll see Jupiter shining big and bright just above the horizon along the arc of the ecliptic, with the smaller Saturn slightly above it, right above the arc of the ecliptic that they're both traveling on, and you'll find it to the left or the east of Jupiter. But by the winter solstice, you'll see only what looks like one luminary in the sky when Jupiter and Saturn are so closely conjunct that you can't tell them apart, and you'll find it just below the constellation of Capricorn. So let's take a look back to what we commonly call 1623, that next closest great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. As you can see, the conjunction of these two luminaries is not always occurring during the same time of day or even in the same season every 20 years, and they don't always occur in the same constellation either. So as you can see back in what we commonly call August of 1623, when the great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn was visible above the Earth's northern hemisphere horizon, it's over the eastern horizon this time, found in the very beginnings of the constellation of Leo. But for this decoding, let's roll it back in time from here 3 more years, back to what we commonly call 1620 on the winter solstice. So we're looking at a sky story picture exactly 400 years in the past from this great conjunction that's going to be coming up on the winter solstice of what we commonly call 2020. And it's closer to this sky story picture that we're looking at here, where specifically we find the planet Jupiter right above the head of Cetus the whale that we're looking for. This same combination, as we saw in the last decoding, is where Jupiter is above the head of Cetus. We decoded was Abraham's firstborn son, Ishmael. And also note Saturn's position here. Just before midnight on the winter solstice of 1620, 400 years ago, Saturn is found to be just at the foot of the constellation Gemini, just out of the reach of Orion's hand. But what we're going to do first is focus again on this specific alignment. And we're looking at Jupiter's approximate 12-year cycle. Here we're finding Jupiter right above the head of the constellation of Cetus the whale. And that's what we call it nowadays, right? But as we've learned previously, the ancient Egyptians saw a big baby with a hawk's head, and his wings that were spread open, they saw in the constellation of Pisces. So it's the combination of Cetus and Pisces the ancient Egyptians called the baby Horus, remember. We also learned that Aries, in combination with the head of Cetus and Pisces, forms what the ancient Egyptians called the Eye of Horus. And it's the symbol of Jupiter and the symbol for a prescription, the RX sign, that also is going to tie into this. So let's take a look at some information that you can find on a site called Etymology Online, where we're first going to look at the origins of the word Jupiter to start us off and form some amazing connections from it. So Etymology Online tells us that this word goes back to ancient Rome. And you want to know that in Latin, in ancient Rome, there was no letter J. It was the letter I. So instead of Jupiter, it was Iupiter. Or the origins of this word come from Deu, meaning God, and Pater, meaning father. So Deupater, or Iupiter, Jupiter, as we say it today. It also says to compare the word Jupiter to the Greek Zeus Pater, Father Zeus, and in Sanskrit, Deus Pater, meaning Heavenly Father. So if you put those together as well, Zeus Pater and Deus Pater, you can still hear Jupiter. Now when you search the origins of the word Zeus, as we're told is referenced here in the word Jupiter, you find that the Greeks called Zeus the supreme god and master of others. So from Zeus, then we search the very close-sounding Greek word Jesus. But remember, there was no J, so that's Iesus. This was what came out of translating the Aramaic name Yehoshua into Greek. But if we just follow this sound in these origins of the words, Zeus Pater, Deus Pater, Zeus, Jesus, you're starting to form the connections. And we're not the first to obviously make these connections, just laying down the groundwork here for what's coming. So keeping these word origins of the Roman god Jupiter, the Greek god Zeus, and the Christian god Jesus in mind, let's read some bits from this article that goes back to what we commonly call 1999 on a site called The Straight Dope, where the question was answered there about what the pharmacist symbol RX means. And we're going to see how this ties in as well. The simple answer is that the RX is an abbreviation for the Latin word recipere, now recipe, which means take thou. In the days before manufactured drugs, apothecaries, who were also doctors, would write out a formula for medications. They would mix up and then compound these ingredients to make drugs or remedies. This article cites a second theory, quoting from the author of a 1931 book titled Devils, Drugs, and Doctors. Quote, RX is not as frequently supposed an abbreviation of the Latin word for recipe, but as an invocation to Jupiter, a prayer for his aid to make the treatment effective. Sometimes in old medical manuscripts, all the R's occurring in the text were crossed. In other words, the RX symbol was a corruption of the ancient symbol for the god Jupiter. If you're an astrology fan, you know the symbol, which has a very similar crossed leg at the bottom right. The Straight Dope article goes on. Nonsense, says Phil Griego, owner of a local pharmacy called Phil's Pills. He should know. I called him because he has the RX symbol incorporated into his logo. He says the R probably came from recipe, but the pharmaceutical symbol used to be an I with an X below it instead of the R, and it was called the Eye of Horus. According to Phil, the Egyptian god Horus was the god of pharmacy. As soon as he said it, I remembered seeing a pharmacia in Juarez, Mexico, with the eyeball X picture in its logo. The medieval Latin word pharmacia, a medicine, comes from the Greek word pharmakia, use of drugs, from pharmakon, drug or remedy. One source suggested a connection between the word pharmacy and the Egyptian term pharmakai, bestower of security, which the god Thoth, patron of physicians, conferred as approbation on a ferryman who managed a safe crossing. Whoa, hey Jupiter, scoot over for Horus. The Eye of Horus, or Udjat or Wedjat, became a powerful symbol in ancient Egypt. And some of the information that this article closes with is going to sound very familiar, as we've already looked at much of it and decoded it in part 2 of our Decoding of Ancient Egypt video, but this is a good reminder to close the article with. So the article ends saying that the Eye of Horus was worn as an amulet to ensure good health and ward off sickness. The Eye of Horus is depicted as a human eye and eyebrow, decorated with the markings seen under the eyes of falcons, since Horus had the head of a falcon. The right eye represented the sun, and the left eye the moon. The left eye is the origin of the pharmacist symbol for prescription, RX. A variation of this symbol is an eye with a pyramid associated with Freemasonry. It's also found on the Great Seal of the United States and on the U.S. $1 bill. Something that we'll definitely get into in a future decoding, that last bit about the symbol being associated with Freemasonry and found to be on the Great Seal of the United States and on the back of the U.S. $1 bill. Now we're going to take a look at the Gospel of Luke in the New Testament of the Bible and start to see what Jesus has to do with this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So from a site called BibleGateway.com, we're going to look at the King James Version of the Bible of Luke chapter 2, beginning at verse 42, where we find the story of Jesus picks up from the time that he's 12 years old. And when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast. And in this verse, the custom of the feast that they're talking about here is the feast at Passover, the Jewish holy day that we decoded way back in our first decoding, where we're also looking at the story of Jesus at Easter, occurring right around the same time of the Jewish holy day of Passover week. Now it's Passover week that this verse from Luke is referencing. So Luke chapter 2 verse 43 goes on. And when they had fulfilled the days, as they returned, the child Jesus tarried behind in Jerusalem, and Joseph and his mother knew not of it. But they, supposing him to have been in the company, went a day's journey. And when they sought him among their kinfolk and acquaintance, and when they found him not, they turned back again to Jerusalem, seeking him. And it came to pass after 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. This is why using the King James Version of the Bible is so helpful to see this connection. The word doctor is used here. And we hear that word today and probably think first of a medical doctor, but that's not exactly what the Bible's talking about when the 12-year-old Jesus is found at the temple with the doctors. When you do a search of the origins of the word doctor on Etymology Online again, it will give you a whole better idea of why Jesus at 12 years old was found to be in the temple with the doctors, as the word doctor meant originally church father, religious teacher, advisor, scholar. As a noun, teacher, to show, teach, cause to know, originally make to appear right, to take, accept. And that last bit, to take or accept, ties back to the prescription symbol, right? To take, thou. But Etymology Online also gives the origin of the word doctor in verb form. And for what we've been dealing with collectively, as this farce I disrespectfully called a Rona, as we've also previously decoded, it's this last bit from Etymology Online about the word doctor that is just as interesting to consider. To doctor is to alter, disguise, for the purpose of deception, falsify. So connecting the dots, you can see why it is doctors that were chosen by who we call the Liar Liar Pants on Fire Secret Drama Society to take center stage now in this deceptive Dorona show. The church fathers. And whether it's believing in the church fathers who told everyone this year not to celebrate any of their usual holy days as they always have, but to instead celebrate fear in a mask and play a non-speaking part in the doctor's modern-day Dorona show, well, you can see that it's really all the same when looked at this way. Luke chapter 2 ends the story of Jesus in the temple at 12, at verse 52, when it says, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man." So we pick up Jesus' story in Luke chapter 3, verse 23, at the point where Jesus is said to have begun his ministry. Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli. Then it goes on to list Jesus' lineage traced all the way back to Adam, and that's Adam and Eve of Genesis. And then it gets into the period of Jesus' story from there that goes into what is now called the 40-day season of Lent, leading up to Jesus' crucifixion. But in the Gospel of Luke, here in the story of Jesus, noted are the ages of 12 and 30. And that's no coincidence that this is the same amount of years for both the cycles of the planet Jupiter and the planet Saturn. So let's cue up another screenshot of this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, this time taking a look at the Spring Equinox time of year to start with, in the Northern Hemisphere, during the first hour that the sun is going down. We're choosing this time to start, one, because that's when sources tell us that the Jewish day on the calendar begins at sunset. So we're choosing to start because, remember, the Gospel of Luke in the Bible tells us to start here around this time of year, when Jesus was 12 and left in the temple with the doctors in Jerusalem. It was, remember, just after Passover week, as it's celebrated in the Jewish tradition. So we're right before that time, right, at the Spring Equinox time of year. So from this screenshot, we can see what's happening in the sky story here, where we have the planets Jupiter and Saturn together in that combination that was the baby Horus to the ancient Egyptians, the constellations of Cetus and Pisces. Remember that this great conjunction, as it's called, does not happen in the same constellations every 20 years. And before we get into this a little bit further, something else just to take note of is that this same length of 20 years is a certain what you were taught is a government or a country's, but it's really a corporation's bankruptcy cycle. That bankruptcy cycle also occurs every 20 years as well. So tying that into what's currently going on also with the Dorona hoax, as I call it, well, it starts to make a whole lot of sense, but I think that those ties will leave for yet another video. So back to this 20-year cycle of these great conjunctions. When Jupiter and Saturn come together every 20 years, well, this cycle takes hundreds of years to repeat. So it's a very long cycle of great conjunctions every 20 years that have to happen before you find a great conjunction occurring back in the same constellation again. But for our purposes in this decoding, we're going to find a Jupiter and Saturn conjunction that's similar enough to what we're looking for if we take a look at the sky story during the Spring Equinox time of year in what we commonly call the year 1940, where you can see that Jupiter is just above the western horizon of the Earth with Saturn that's just a bit above that. And they're both found in this combination of Cetus and Pisces. Or you can think of it as right in the healing site of the Eye of Horus. Or the falcon eye of the baby or child Horus in ancient Egypt. But in this story, the baby or the child of 12 years old in this story found to be in the company of temple doctors, someone who himself grew to be a rabbi, but also a healer of blind eyes too. This is Jesus. Coming upon the time of year where Passover week is celebrated in the Jewish tradition, which, remember in the story of Jesus, Jesus was Jewish. This story in Luke jumps from Jesus being a child of 12 to the next thing we know, Jesus is 30. And in this story, that's because, as you can see, the constellation of Cetus is descending into the western horizon of the Earth. And Cetus is always, as we know, tied by Eridanus the river, or you can think of it as the 12-year-old child Jesus in this story is tied to the constellation of Orion. This is corresponding to the transition in the story from Jesus ending his childhood at 12 and then picking it back up in the story to Jesus being a man at 30, where he begins his ministry. The ages of 12 and 30 are specifically corresponding to the approximate 12-year cycle of the planet Jupiter and the approximate 30-year cycle of the planet Saturn. In this alignment, where both Jupiter and Saturn are found to be with Cetus, or the child Jesus in this story of Jesus' life, according to the Gospel of Luke from the New Testament of the Bible. As you can see when we move forward to the sky story picture, just a few weeks later, in what we commonly call 1940, so after the time of the week of Passover, you can see that while the sun is setting, the planet Jupiter is already below the Earth's horizon in the west, with most of the constellation of Cetus descended with it as well. This corresponds specifically to the 12-year-old Jesus childhood ending, and then the jump in the story in Luke from when Jesus is 12 years old, then to him being 30. Because you can see it's the planet with the approximate 30-year cycle, Saturn, that's still above the western horizon, at the same time that the man, or Orion, or in this story, the 30-year-old man Jesus, is also still above the western horizon of the Earth, with his bow aimed right at the planet Saturn. So interestingly enough, is that if we go forward in what we commonly call the spring of 1940 to about 8.5, 9 months later, just about, again, the length of time a woman here on Earth experiences a full-term pregnancy, we're getting right to the time Christians celebrate Christmas. So on what we commonly call December 25th of 1940, we see the great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn very close together, right above the head of Cetus. This is something that we're definitely going to be looking at again in our next decoding, so we'll keep that in mind. But for this one, now you know some more of the real reasons and the connections between the Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and Christian gods, and how they tie together a thread of a healing prescription for curing many blind eyes to clear vision within the story. It's only with this knowledge of the truth that will help us all see our way through the darkness. And remember, if you live here in what we commonly call America, in the month of what we commonly call December, get outside the hour after the sun goes down and look up at the real all-seeing eye for the great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. You're going to find they're arcing toward the western horizon of the Earth along the ecliptic all throughout the month of what we commonly call December of 2020. We're going to see the closest of all great conjunctions we've seen for the last 400 years. I hope that this will inspire you to look up. And with that, we'll end things here for now and pick it back up again in our next decoding. Until then, be well.